Hello, everyone. I don't know if I should count this as a Jack's Notes or just a first thoughts or whatever video I used to make. But honestly, this is one of those things where I just really wanted to make a video on this simply because it's one of those things that I have gotten myself involved in before. And because I noticed that people are talking about it online. And I noticed that I got some reactions from some of the things that I said online. And I figured, you know what? Maybe this actually is worth making a video about. So, with that, without further ado, let's talk about. Hold on a second. Let's talk about Alex Garland's Civil War, a film by A24 that'll be coming soon. So, let's actually get on talking about it. Now, we should probably start with the premise. It's the Second American Civil War, and basically Texas and California both secede and are essentially on the same side as part of a Western alliance. Florida leads a Southern alliance. I don't know how Florida is able to do this. Now, the reasons why they split from the Union, it's hard to really say. It could be something based on, but assuming that because they have Texas and California on the same side, I'm guessing it either has something to do with civil rights or economic management. Please note that DC is in a state where they're killing journalists, and the whole war has essentially put the identity of being an American into question, as being an American is no longer enough to compile an identity that everyone is familiar with. To put this into perspective, when I say I'm an American in the Hispanic community, I typically say I am an estadounidense, or a United States person. Because in the context of Latin America, saying that you're from America is kind of like a Chinese person saying they're from Asia. Yes, they're technically correct, but Asia is a pretty large continent. You have to specify. Or it's kind of like someone saying they're European. Okay, what kind of European? Are we talking French? Are we talking English? Are we talking Scottish? Are we talking Spanish? Are we talking Russian? Ukrainian? What are we talking about? And that's kind of what American has sort of become in this concept. Now, I'll admit that it does seem kind of interesting, but I don't think this is what a lot of people think about when someone says Civil War, or they typically see it as a repeat of the original Civil War from 1861 to 1864. That's sort of what comes to mind. And admittedly, I think this it might just be like a swing and a miss. Like maybe they misinterpreted what exactly people were thinking. Long story short, it kind of feels a little bit toothless. Yes, it does have some interesting. It does have a couple of interesting things going on, but I don't think it really hits with what people. I don't think it hits the zeitgeist, so to speak. Now you're probably thinking, Jack, you're not telling me you have thought of something better than this. Actually, I think I might have. So, and this is kind of what the majority of this video is going to be about. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you my declassified Project Phoenix Blue, which is a Second American Civil War workshop. Basically, this is something that I've been working on for quite a while. It was around the same time that was putting the finishing touches on the book. Which, by the way, if you're wondering what the progress on the other book that I'm working on right now, I'm still in the editing phase, in the copy edit phase. This seems like we're basically hitting the home stretch. So, let's actually talk about this. Feel free to use this if you want. I might still continue working on this story and turn it into a book if you guys want. But until then, let's actually get into the nitty gritty. So I should probably start with what the parameters for this story essentially is. So it kind of starts with the insurrection of January 6th, and before you start, and this would probably be the cue for anyone else to leave if they're thinking about, oh, this is going to get very political. Well, yeah, it's a Civil War story. It's going to be inherently political regardless of how you look at it. So yeah, we have the insurrection, and so basically, uh, what would eventually become Dixie, which is the insurrectionist faction that I'm naming, basically comes from the first insurrection. Now there are a couple of other events that get modified. For example, the Russo-Ukraine war that is currently ongoing. It would have already ended once PMCs sent in mechs. In fact, becomes the first use of mechs, and Ukraine successfully repels Russian forces, even taking back Crimea. Now, I should mention right here, you're probably seeing that I mentioned a Babylonian war, which involves Israel invading Jordan. I gotta be honest, I think I was kind of I was high on weed when I was writing part of this, and I just thought, you know what, let's throw in a crackhead event. Something absolutely ludicrous that would not happen was unless someone was screwing around. And now we have the Israel-Palestine crisis going on right now. I'm not gonna get too deep into it. All I'm gonna say is the people that wanted the war are the politicians, and the people that didn't want the war are the civilians. That's pretty much it. Anyways, there's a couple of other events going on, such as the oil crash, which kind of sends America into a depression. And, yeah, basically, we get a repeat of the Trump presidency. And just when he's about to be inaugurated, that's when we start, right when a second president's about to be inaugurated, that's when we start to see this president, which we'll name President Riker. Basically, long story short, that's when basically President Riker does not want to give up his position. That's when the Civil War starts. So yeah, it's definitely talking about some. I'll be honest. A lot of times when I do write, it's sort of a cope. It's sort of a copium thing going on. Like that's where I throw in my energies into. And sometimes I make something interesting. Sometimes I don't. And I don't know. You guys decide. So what makes this different from Alex Garland's Civil War? Well, primarily the big one is, of course, the diversity in militias. I know what you're thinking. Oh, this is gonna be, one of those SJW thingies. Well, yeah, I think it's mostly because, essentially, various militias on both sides start to form up. Some of those, particularly with the intent of defending their lives and way of living. A lot of descendants of immigrants start to take up arms, and other minorities such as LGBT members, people of various religions, and just in general people who would basically be under threat in a Dixie victory. Long story short, they see that, look, we're gonna die either way. At least we'll die fighting, so to speak. Or at least that's the attitude. And that's, I don't know. I don't want to start making accusations, but I did notice that it looked a little too whitewash. I don't know. Maybe. Like, there's definitely going to be a lot of white people. There's definitely going to be a lot of white perspectives. That's for sure. But at the same time, you can't really... I think you can't really make a story about the United States without the perspective of the immigrant. And that's probably one of the big noticeable things is that a lot of descendants of immigrants get really involved into this war, and there are various reasons for it, which I like to call the three H's. H number one, home. I don't know if you've noticed this about people of other descendants that aren't European, but long story short, anytime I'll just go ahead and just bring up a little personal story. Anytime I talk with someone who is of Latin descent, as in they were born outside of the United States, anytime someone says, where are you from? You know, I don't know if they're asking about, where was I born, which was California, or what my roots are, or like where am I a descendant from, like which is Mexico and Guatemala, because my mom's from Guatemala, my dad's from Mexico, so I end up having to ask, are you asking where I was born or where my parents are from? It's something that almost drives me nuts in that regard, but I kind of understand it. And that kind of happens because of my fluency in Spanish. But long story short, the reason I live in the United States and the reason why I don't plan on moving to Mexico anytime soon is because this is the only real home that I know. Alright? I've gotten so used to, eating hamburgers and whatnot. I've gotten so used to the American lifestyle, I don't see myself living any other way. And that goes double for many other immigrants. If you've ever heard the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Unit, you'll know that that feeling flies along with them. Essentially, they see themselves as American, not Japanese, which is why they fought on the American side, both as interpreters and as combatants, essentially fighting with the same ferocity for home and for liberty as, say, the IJN fought for their emperor. And that's something that I think we'll see later on in this story. The second one, of course, honor. Essentially, your patriotism cannot be questioned if it's answered in blood. Essentially, you cannot say that you, my friend, are more American than me, because at least I fought in the wars that America asked me to, while you just sat at home. Like, that's an attitude that a lot of immigrant veterans have, and in fact, that's something that a lot of Hispanics sometimes have. There's the term "somos más americano que el hijo del anglosajón" or something like that, where I didn't choose to cross the border crossed me, kind of thing. At least that's the attitude, but that's more of an Hispanic exclusive kind of thing. I know for a lot of other people, it's like, hey, I am loyal to this country, alright? I pledge allegiance to the flag regardless, alright? Because this is my home and I will defend it with everything. And, I'll join the military if I have to. And, of course, history. Essentially, it establishes our footprint in the American narrative. To say, it's like, oh yeah, you're a descendant of the Mayflower? Okay, that's cool. My parents fought in World War II under the United States, under this regiment and this regiment, yada yada yada. Long story short, it basically entrenches our name in the historical narrative, so to speak. And because this is taking place in 2040, i.e. 20 years after the fall of Kabul, and 20 years after Ukrainian refugees arrived here in the United States, we are essentially going to see a large amount of Afghan and Ukrainian refugees fighting in this war, almost fanatically. We're talking about the children of Afghan interpreters, the children of Ukrainian territorial defense forces, that kind of thing. So that's one of the big differences. It's basically going to have a much more diverse scope, because Alex Garland's A24 Civil War, that one looks like it's going to be told mostly from the perspective of politicians and journalists, which is an important perspective, but also give perspective to, say, a lot of the civilians and a lot of the troops fighting in this war. and why they're getting involved in the violence. Alright, so the second difference, and I think this is something that not a lot of people talk about when discussing a modern civil war, and that would be what are the opinions of the other countries getting involved. So here's the thing: in the first Civil War, nations that had the ability to intervene were almost uninterested, either because they didn't see the Americans, because at the time America was a fledgling nation, so they didn't see much of a problem if it fell or rose. And those that did have an interest in the outcome almost didn't have the ability to do anything. We're talking about Mexico and Canada here. However, in the modern age, because the United States is a big player in global politics, almost every nation has a vested interest in the outcome of this war. After all, the United States is the largest military force, it's the largest economic force, and it has a seat in the UN Security Council. So immediately, Russia and China would try to supply Dixie as a way to weaken the United States. Sort of use it for their own propaganda, as well as test their own equipment. They would essentially start sending supplies so that Dixie can actually fight their wars. Maybe get rid of some aging arsenals. However, for the Union, they would receive support from NATO as well as other allies, particularly in monetary and equipment. They wouldn't actually start sending soldiers, or if they do, it would be in a limited capacity. Mexico and Canada, however, would directly intervene by sending in troops, essentially to fight for the Union, simply because America is their biggest trading partner. And they can't really when one of the sides would very much rather be isolationist and almost cut off the countries from trade, you can see why they would have a vested interest in making sure that the war goes the way they want to go. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another third difference, and this would be simply because of recent events and also just because of the nature of warfare, this is where things start to get really unconventional. So basically, I don't know what happened. Hang on a second. So basically, Ukraine has proven that unconventional, asymmetric, and guerrilla warfare can be used effectively in the modern age to basically counter even a superior military. Aside from the millions of firearms that are circulating within the United States, militias will also arm themselves with improvised weapons, traps, equipment, and vehicles. And these are just a couple of examples. For example, the vampire system, which is something that can be installed on the back of a pickup truck. Or say, for example, I remember the Sky Warden, which is basically an up-armored air tractor. It's a crop duster, and one could reasonably assume, hey, what if we just put hydro rockets on an old P-51 Mustang? You can essentially use it as a ground pounder. Of course, this would also mean that the conventional forces would have equipment that is much more advanced. Say, for example, the Rapid Dragon system, or say the laser anti-air system. Some of these things that are either proposed or already in service, but not widely. Or say, for example, the deployment of drones with machine guns attached to them. If you guys haven't seen FPS Russia, for those who don't know, he's basically a martyr in the GunTube community. Anyways, he did a video in promotion with Call of Duty Black Ops 2, where he demonstrated the use of a quad rotor drone with a machine gun attached to it. And now in the 2020s, we're actually seeing those things being deployed in Ukraine. So that would be crazy. So yeah, they would basically show pretty much the insanity that would be ensuing. So, quick disclosure, I should probably mention, I'm not a huge fan of mecha as as a genre, or rather, as a piece of military equipment. Simply because it's a lot more complicated, and because, well, let's just say all the resources that you use to make a giant fighting robot could just be used to make a bunch more tanks. That being said, I can see the value in maybe using a mech, simply because it could potentially go into places where tanks and other conventional equipment may not be able to go. So I do see some value in there. Anyways, let's get on with the parade. So the first mech that I want to show is the Ares Goliath Mark III, which is basically a mech made for the Republic of Dixie. And one of the big factors is, aside from the fact that it carries a lot of equipment, is also just the fact that it is large and intimidating. And most of the systems are almost automated, which, yeah, does make it an effective fighter in that regard, but it also makes it more prone to being. It makes it more prone to. It basically means you're going to need to. It's going to need a lot of downtime. A lot of downtime that, if it's not implemented properly, could potentially lead to breakdowns further in the future. Next mech in the parade is the M1A2 or A3 Grant. Essentially, it is a mech with a little bit more. It's a little bit more. How do I say this? This is the more logical mech that I would see. Like, if we ever actually do make battle mechs, this would probably be the system that I would think the United States military would use, as it has more redundant systems, and it's a lot more modular. And it's being piloted by 2 crew members. One pilot, who is in charge of the motion of the arms and the legs, as well as in control of most of the weapon systems, and of course a WSO, a weapon systems officer, who is pretty much in charge of the radar, in charge of radio, pretty much making sure that, pretty much keeping an eye on things, making sure things don't overheat and such. Kind of the same way of how most two-seater planes operate. So that's would be on the Union side. And here's one that is, I guess, sort of a joke mech, I kind of want to say. It is basically what Mexico would be fielding. And the best way that I could describe this kind of mech is, it is essentially an up-armored bobcat. Or imagine a bobcat that can walk and that has machine guns. And maybe a tow missile if they're feeling spicy. That's basically what we got here. It's an up-armored bobcat with arms. It might not even have legs, as those things might be treads, but it is easy to use. It is very quick to replace if it gets damaged. It doesn't even come with its own original engine. It can take a V8 from a Ford F-150 if it needs to. Long story short, it's basically something that can be repaired, and if it can't be repaired, it can easily be replaced. Long story short, it's kind of a disposable tank, so to speak, which may not necessarily be what you'd want, but it is, if fielded in large quantities, it might actually pose a threat. Anyways, the logistics, this is where things get nuts, because the Union would try to deny supplies and resources for Dixie to wage its war. Essentially, imagine Sherman's march to the sea, but on a much grander scale. We're talking farms getting napalmed, oil pipelines bursting, bridges collapsing, that kind of stuff. And the civilians will start to feel it a lot harder, which would eventually lead to Dixie cracking down on possible dissent. Essentially, it could mean that people start to resent the Union because they're essentially trying to starve out the population, or they might resent Dixie for starting the whole war in in the first place. Also, the United States Navy would then be blockading the eastern coast and the Gulf of Mexico, and Unionists, i.e. the Unionists, i.e. the militias, would start to adapt to techniques used by native tribes, essentially hunting and gathering in the forests. You know, sort of picking wild berries, hunting in the middle of nowhere, essentially trying to go back to to the ways of the nomadic tribes. Anyways, this is where also just a sort of just as a little sort of joke. Waffle House some Waffle House restaurants still stay open. That's yeah. This is more of just a. If you guys have heard of the Waffle House Index, long story short, if a Waffle House stays open, it means things aren't so bad. If it's on a limited menu, yeah, it means things are bad. We should probably start packing just in case, but it's we still have it open. And if a Waffle House closes, then oh my God, we are pretty much screwed. So yeah, Dixie would basically say, leave the Waffle Houses alone. Like even if they might be harboring certain people, just leave them alone. We need those things open, just to say that things are okay. Anyways, in terms of communication, this is where Dixie in the Union would try to monitor all communications. A cyber warfare is being waged between the two. Meanwhile, Unionist militias would try to bring back the Navajo Windtalker Code. If anyone knows about the Navajo Code Talkers or the Navajo radio operators, long story short, they communicated in their own language because it would be the one thing that the Japanese could not if they do intercept, they could not translate or figure out what it meant because it was in a completely different language, one that had no ties to English or very few ties, if at all. So, long story short, there would be a massive cyber warfare being waged in the Civil War, which would mean that some militias resort to using other communication techniques, such as hiding messages in JPEGs, communicating through video game chat, like sending messages to people through video games, because that's the last place you'd expect important military decisions to be communicated. Even resorting to just using physical messages by hiding them in the USB flash drive, using carrier pigeons, or just straight up sending messages through memes. Kind of the same way that NAFO has been able to organize an entire logistics infrastructure to help Ukraine. Yeah, something like that. So, anyways, that's sort of the scope of what we're going with. And I also want to establish that the tone of the whole story would pretty much be all over the place. Like, one minute it's a lot like Call of Duty, the next it's kind of like Generation Kill, where people are being sarcastic and almost nihilistic about things. Then it's going to switch to depression, then it switches to political thriller. Overall, it's kind of a well-rounded experience. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the events that are going to go on in this story. So first, as I mentioned, the birth of the Holy Republic of Dixie. Long story short, this is basically a conservative fever dream. We're talking about radical conservative. So long story short, it kind of starts with the takeover of Washington, D.C. and the eventual secession of Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and they begin to invade Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New York, eventually switching their attention to the Midwest. So you kind of end up with a division, with a separation kind of similar like this. Not all the way, but you kind of start to see it. You kind of start to see that this is a bigger chunk than before. They don't take Texas, but I'll explain later why that is. So in St. Louis, this is where Dixie starts to make its first couple of moves into the Midwest, with the eventual objective to take Chicago. However, this is where it begins to encounter resistance from what would eventually become the New Continental Army. Essentially a militia that you'll probably hear more about in this story, and from which the main perspective would be about. This buys enough time for civilians to evacuate and the National Guard to reorganize and essentially push Dixie out. So, meanwhile, in Texas, they start the blockade of Interstate 10, basically the interstate that goes from Louisiana to Texas. The National Guard shows up, and all I need to say about Texas is that you know how there's the theory that eventually it's going to go blue because a lot of people from California start to start to start to vote in the other direction. Yeah, for as much of fear mongering that a lot of people do about a sort of blue shift or a blue wave, that's not exactly what's going on. I think it's more just that for as much talk about secession that Texas makes, it doesn't actually want to secede, which, again, going back to the example, if you put California and Texas in the same side, it's because something really wrong went down. And that's kind of the thing going on here. Essentially, they try to take siege of the capital in Austin, and they kind of overestimated how many people would be willing to do that. And this is more something from what I've experienced personally. I've actually, I can safely say that I defended the Texas Capitol. That's all I'm going to say. Anyways, so they blockade the Interstate 10, only allowing refugees to pass, and it becomes the site of the first mech-on-mech battle in the Second American Civil War. Another front that they tried to open up would be the Battle of New York, where Dixie attempts to open another front in New York Harbor, essentially landing in Brooklyn and trying to take Manhattan. However, mountaineer divisions managed to dig themselves in by maintaining a network of zip lines and mechs hiding within the buildings, essentially creating killing lanes within the city. So, anyways, Canadian and reinforcements eventually arrive and begin to support the push of the Dixie forces out of New York. So they don't even make it onto the actual state. Anyways, I did say that this war would essentially encompass other states, other countries. So essentially, Mexico declares war on Dixie and begins to attract the attention, and Dixie makes preparations to invade Matamoros. That is a city in Tamaulipas, which is just south of Texas's southern tip. Anyways, the Dixie plan was then to sort of invade Mexico, then go into Texas and sort of surround the blockade in I-10. However, Mexico essentially lures the Dixie's forces into a trap, and this is where they introduce the new VAR 37 mech that I talked about earlier. And with some of the drug cartels getting involved, they eventually deny a beachhead for Dixie. And this is sort of where I kind of wanted to sort of screw around again, where, okay, Mexico cuts a deal with the drug cartels where if they help them in this war, if they help them with this war, they would essentially receive amnesty from all of their previous crimes, and as long as they don't get involved in the drug cartels again, they are pretty much free to roam. They are pretty much free from persecution, which sounds great, but then you realize a lot of these guys would end up getting killed. They essentially, this is where the few surviving cartel members end up lending their experience along with, say, the experience of Mexican special forces. Because, long story short, because they've been fighting each other for so long, and now they're fighting Dixie, they are able to gain enough experience to see what works and what doesn't work. And eventually, these two groups formed the basis of the Mexican Expeditionary Force. Well, I'll bring that up later on again. Anyways, once again, because I'm dealing with crackhead energy in my brain right now, this is where things start to get a little crazy because we get a second Battle of Gettysburg, and while it's not particularly the most important battle of the war, the significance and the irony is not lost on many of the troops. Essentially, the Union is camped out near the site of the old Battle of Gettysburg. Meanwhile, it is the actual town of Gettysburg that receives most of the brunt, and essentially it gets turned into rubble. Basically, Dixie forces take over the town, and the Union just pretty much begins shelling it. It almost feels like the Battle of Fallujah in that regard, since you get a lot more intense urban fighting and just shelling from artillery and bombing from aircraft. So, yeah. Yeah, it kind of gets a little crazy over there. Anyways, one of the big events that's where the story gets its name is Operation Phoenix Blue, where essentially they try to lure Dixie into thinking that Savannah is going to be the site of a major beach landing by the U.S. Navy and Marines. Eventually, it just ends up being a feint as American, Canadian, and Mexican paratroopers begin to descend and use the I-95 freeway to land their troops. Meanwhile, the I-81 would be used to evacuate the few remaining civilians in Dixie territory. This creates a sort of overwhelming flow for the remaining Dixie forces, and eventually it decides to consolidate in Washington, D.C., creating what would become Fortress Columbia. And this is where things just start absolutely getting crazy. This is where we start to see the bloodiest fighting in the war as Allied forces try to fight the last of the Dixie Army, essentially tightening the ring. And many soldiers resort to suicide bombings and attempt to destroy prized artifacts within DC. And by July 4th, while yes, a surrender was issued by the Dixie general, some of the troops just decide it's just better off to fight until the very bitter end. Mexico takes over the White House and formally returns it to the United States, and the Capitol building is actually captured by by the new Continental Army, essentially establishing a militia as the group that hands back the capital to the Union, and thus ending the war. Long story short, it's kind of like the final. It's kind of like the Battle of Berlin in terms of retaking the Reichstag and planting the Red Banner, except it's retaking the capital and planting the U.S. A modified version of the American flag. Again, more on that later. Anyways, and finally we come back to the aftermath of the whole battle, of the whole war. Essentially, hundreds of thousands of Americans were lost in perhaps the biggest war on American soil, and many more are being prosecuted for their war crimes. And long story short, some of the people they had to let go simply because they were coerced into fighting, or simply because they had their own had various other reasons, say more loyalty to the states or loyalty to family, so to speak. So it kind of becomes a bit of a mess. The United States loses some prestige in global standings, and long story short, the reconstruction process is similar to that of Germany and Japan during World War II. However, there is a silver lining in the sense that citizens are now pushing for more reforms in the national government, in the federal government, not only to improve standards of living in the United States, but also to sort of prevent anything like this to happen again. So yeah, it kind of leaves you in that state of, we won the war, now we have to deal with the mess that we created, which is something that not a lot of people really think about when they make war stories. For example, probably the only story that I know of that kind of got it right, and I say kinda, would be Star Wars, and that's simply because it's it's kind of a lot cleaner in the sense of, hey, we defeated the Empire, now we're reinstating the old Republic. Yay! But we're gonna call it the New Republic. And of course, that leads into the sequel trilogy, which everyone kind of hates. But at the very least, the ending kind of shows that, yeah, things are not 100% hunky dory. There is still much more that needs to be done before we can actually celebrate. Not just by the part of the government, but also by some of the citizens. Essentially, the militia is gonna have to stay around in order to make sure the government doesn't screw it up. Anyways, that's really all I got for this story. Again, if you guys, I probably didn't even, describe it properly. Just to understand that there's a lot more going on in here than just than just what you saw. Like, there's way more going on. It gets messy. It gets insane. And honestly, if you guys want me to make this story, I can. But right now, I'm more interested in the other book that I'm writing right now. Anyways, sorry if I've kept you guys out of the loop for a while. Anyways. With that being said, I do want to show you guys something else that I've kind of neglected, and that's kind of my new workspace. Just because I'm a little proud of it, you know, just because I want to brag. So I don't know if you can see this, but this is my old laptop. Long story short, it's not in use anymore. I'm probably gonna have to take it into the recyclery. Anyways, this is my new desk. Yeah, I have a gaming rig now, or at least at least I have a gaming PC now. It is basically and I'm just reading from the receipt right now. a CyberPower PC with an Intel Core i5 and a GeForce 4060 graphics card. Again, I have no idea what half of that wording means, but I've heard this is what I got. Also, it's probably a little sucky that you guys can't actually see what's inside because of the way that I have it oriented. Yeah, not exactly the best, but you gotta understand this is simply because I don't know. Maybe I can reorganize it later. But yeah, this is what my new workspace looks like. So, although I'm probably gonna have to get a new chair because as good as this one is, it's a little too low to the ground. But overall, I think this is gonna work for me now. I kind of want to do some streaming once I'm done with some of the preliminary stuff. But yeah, long story short, this is what it looks like when I'm working with. But yeah, long story short, I'm kind of just rearranging some stuff right now. So um, so overall, I like the way the desk looks right now. The one thing I don't like about this room in general, however, is just how much space the bed occupies. It takes up almost half the area of the entire room, so there's not much space for me to work with. Like, I don't know. Like, I kind of want to start to work out a lot more inside this room. I have, hang on. I have resistance bands, which I could use, but the problem is that the door that I would normally use it on, the closet right over there, is right there, and there's this big ass bed in the middle of the whole thing. So I kind of have no choice but to go to a gym to do any workouts because I need to lose weight, man. I really do. But yeah, in general, this is pretty much. So yeah, first thing that I want to do in the new year, get rid of this goddamn bed. I'll probably ask my sister if she wants to keep it or if she just wants me to throw it away because this is technically her bed. And I don't know, maybe she wants it. It's a queen size bed. I don't need a bed this big, especially when it's taking away valuable real estate. You know? I figured I might get a loft bed. I think I have space up here. Probably make a loft bed of my own, or I don't know, get a new one. So yeah, that's something that kind of works me out. Anyways, just let me know what because I do want to stream games, and sort of, get into either Twitch or YouTube streaming. I don't know. I definitely know that I want to start streaming Splatoon 3 games just because you get to hear my quipping live. And I don't know, maybe I'll get into like Forza Horizon 5 or Call of Duty if it ever gets good again. But yeah, that's sort of what's been going on in the channel lately. So yeah, just consider that this is pretty much me in the new year. Oh my god, I really need to lose some weight, and I need to shave. But yeah, what do you? So yeah, just let me know in the comment section what you guys thought of this video. If I should proceed with the Civil War story, if you guys want me to do anything else. Because honestly, I'm almost done with the original book that I was working on. So maybe I can go take a small hiatus, call it a victory, and just work on the Civil War story. Or if you guys want me to just pursue both or stick with streaming, I can go either way. Anyways, leave a like, subscribe, do what YouTube asks you to do, and until then, this is me saying, thank you for being smart. Sayonara.